As the fleet approached orbit over the planet, I noted how calm the humans aboard the bridge seemed. They sat at their stations, or walked through the large space, delivering messages, officers consulting maps on strategy, but none seemed the least bit worried. I frowned at this. True, the battle for orbital control of the planet had been easy, but that was to be expected. Reports had indicated that there was only a small group of cruisers above the planet, and they had been right. I myself had brought those reports to our human allies, and then joined them on the expedition at the orders of the High Military Council. So far, the humans had impressed me. Their ships were neat and orderly, a stark contrast to the haphazard way they seemed to live their lives in general. Their ships were designed unusually, far more weaponry, and a much greater focus on combat practicality over other uses compared to other species, but they had been effective nonetheless. The Armada's arrival in the system had been executed better than almost any operation I had ever witnessed. The ships had jumped into the system, already formed up and in range, opening fire on the opposing forces within seconds. The battle had been over in minutes, only a single human vessel taking damage, and minor at that. Then again, the real test of their prowess would soon begin. Out of the viewing window, I watched the planet that we were now orbiting. Massive, and covered invaluable resources to the war efforts of both sides. It was an important strategic objective. It had been turned into a fortress by our enemies. Energy shields surrounded the planet, and according to the little intel we had, half the planet was covered in bunkers and fortifications around huge factories that pumped out supplies that could be used by the defenders. I did not envy the humans that would land and battle inch by inch to claim the planet. It would be brutal, bloody, and horrific. When the High Command had originally discarded their plans to attack the system, it had been because the projected casualties for taking the planet were in the low billions, a number deemed too high for their strategic gain. Clearly the humans thought otherwise. Turning to Grand Admiral Mardeau, I asked, how soon would the transports be landing on the surface? I wanted my report to the Council to include projections on the timeline of the battle. Mardeau raised his eyebrows, an expression I had learned meant vague amusement, and glanced at me from his place standing in the centre of the bridge. Transports? A little hasty there, don't you think? We've got days till boots on the ground. I drew up in confusion. Days? Well, hopefully. It might be longer, but I don't want enemy reinforcements to arrive. Then he turned to the small group of officers behind him, his face seeming set in stone. Send out the signal. Everyone knows their targets, let's get started. What was this human talking about? Why wait days to begin the invasion? All that would accomplish was letting the enemy dig in further on the planet below, and for reinforcements to be more likely to arrive before we were done. And what had he just ordered to begin? My thoughts were cut short by a roar that came from the entire ship. It shook, and the booms continued without a single pause between them. The guns, I realized. They are firing again, this time with much more firepower. Outside, I could see almost the entire rest of the human armada had also started shooting. And below, I felt myself go cold, my spines jerking up and quivering in horror. The entire planet seemed alight. Blasts rocked the surface, dust and smoke already rising miles into the air. Massive explosions carpeted the planet, many of them large enough to wipe cities off of maps, and then some. And the guns just kept shooting, the roar making the entire flagship vibrate with them. In places, the dust and smoke was replaced by the glow of energy shields, doing what they were meant to. However, less than 5 minutes after the bombardment started, the areas with shields were being ignored completely. They know they can't break through them, so they just ignore them? Surely the humans had to realize that all the targets of value were behind those energy shields. Still, that thought was overshadowed by the horror of what the humans were doing. The guns just kept on firing. For hours. I stood on that bridge and watched the ever-changing view of mushroom clouds and fireballs, and the rising clouds of ash and smoke blotting out everything beneath them. It explained why they had been so careful to rule out the existence of a civilian populace. Eventually I retired to my cabin, falling asleep to the dull roar of the flagship's massive guns firing as fast as their crews could load them. For the next week, there was never a minute where at least one gun wasn't sending shells down onto the planet below. It was 2 days after that, until the smoke cleared enough to see the surface. I had expected it to be craters, holes blown into the earth and piles of rubble. Instead, it was all uniform. A single flowing expanse of melted ground that was broken only by those havens made by the energy shields. The humans had used the 2 days to resupply their guns, At the start of the third, I stood on the bridge and waited for the Grand Admiral to order transports to land at last. Instead, he started giving orders for Phase 2. On either side of the flagship, 2 strange ships moved forward towards the surface. Long and thin, they had holes down the middle of them, round and running down almost their entire length. The Admiral turned to one of his aides. "How deep did you say those shields went again?" The woman responded immediately. 600 feet below the surface, sir." He nodded. "Calibrate accordingly and fire when ready." I rattled my spice of confusion, but waited. Asking the Admiral questions never helped. The man had a tendency for the dramatic. After a few minutes, lights began to run up the sides of the ships on either side of us, enough energy that it was visible running up the center of the ships. Then both of them lurched, moving backwards suddenly, and blasts issued from the holes down their middles. Guns. They have guns larger than the rest of the ship. Again, I was struck by the human desire for firepower. The projectiles they fired were aimed not at the energy shields, but the ground next to them. They hit, and I waited for an explosion. Instead, the grey streak simply vanished, disappearing into the solid melted rock. Then the inside of the 2 shields that had been targeted erupted. The ground was torn upwards, buildings practically disintegrating as they were blasted apart. The debris slammed against the sides of the shields, piling up around the edges. The center of both was left the crater, and I realized that the shells from the 2 massive guns had been sent directly underneath the shielded fortifications. It took half an hour for the ships to be ready to fire again. For the entire time, the humans on the bridge went about their work with the same calm efficiency that they had everything else. Over the course of the day, the process was repeated for each of the shields, until at last the final bubble winked out below. I couldn't help but stare down at the planet, where there had once been hundreds upon hundreds of miles of bunkers, trenches, factories, and mines. There was now nothing but slag, bombed smooth. The newly made desert was broken only by 2 things: the heaps of rubble that had once been shielded areas, now nothing but ruins, and the great clouds of ash that still swirled over past the planet. My reverie was broken when the Admiral at last gave the order. "Load up the transport and secure the surface." He turned to me. "Tell your military council, we have the planet.